Good evening. Tonight I have the privilege to introduce our speakers, Parker Lewis and Dhruv Bansal. In 2017 at Heyman Capital in Dallas, Parker developed the thesis that Bitcoin would become the global reserve currency. He was later a colleague of Dhruv's at Unchained, and in 2019 he began work on Gradually Then Suddenly, a series of essays which have since been published in book form and were cited by Strategy CEO Michael Saylor in his decision to adopt Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset. Now, Parker is working on Bitcoin payments as head of business development at Zaprite, a company here in Austin. Dhruv Bansal is co-founder and CSO at Unchained. Before Unchained, Dhruv and his co-founder Joe Kelly, you just met, founded InfoChips, a company in the big data space where he first heard about Bitcoin. Dhruv and Joe later co-founded Unchained in 2016, which now helps clients secure over 100,000 Bitcoin. Pulling from his physics background, Dhruv wrote a series called Bitcoin Astronomy and popularized the HODL waves, a data science visualization of Bitcoin adoption. And over the last several years, Dhruv has been developing a framework for how everything else will ultimately be decentralized on Bitcoin's robust markets for money. Tonight, drawing on their distinct backgrounds, Parker and Dhruv will explain why Bitcoin's fixed supply is the 0-to-1 innovation and why individuals, institutions, and nation states alike need to take the long view and focus solely on Bitcoin. Without further ado, Parker Lewis and Dhruv Bansal.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay? Yes? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dhruv. Thank you for the nice introduction, Stephen. So before I get started, maybe I'll offer a little bit of context with which I hope that you listen to what you're about to hear today. So as Stephen mentioned, I've had the honor of being a colleague of Parker's for a number of years here at Unchained. And what I learned during that time is that Parker and I are both very similar, but also complementary individuals. I think that's probably true. Those of us who know us well might agree. I think we're both passionate individuals. We're certainly both passionate about Bitcoin. I think we're both first principles thinkers. I think Parker, I can credit us with that. I think we're both very stubborn and difficult to work with sometimes, but it's worth it. And I would say that something that I always treasured at Unchained is because of our complementary backgrounds. I'm a physicist, a programmer, a tech person. Ultimately, Parker, has this great background in finance and capital markets and thinking about monetary policy. Yet we both really appreciate Bitcoin for a lot of the same reasons. In fact, I often felt that when I would come to a conclusion and that Parker would come to the same conclusion, but using a totally different pathway to get there, that just made me feel even more certain in my conclusions. And I think what we're going to be showing you today is a series of conclusions that both Parker and I have come to, oftentimes from completely different origins, using different language, explaining it in different ways, yet always talking about the same thing. And isn't that just the elephant that we call Bitcoin? And so, in the spirit of complementary expertise, we want to walk you through three ideas that ultimately help you understand why Bitcoin is the only thing you need to be paying attention to. So, this is a little bit of a plan for the talk, and we're going to go back and forth as we go through these sections and there's going to be a little bit of a QA at the end. But with that, without further ado, Parker, let's get started.
All right. Good to be here. I want to thank Stephen for the kind introduction, UATX for hosting us, Unchained for throwing the event, Dhruv for partnering on the presentation, and we're good compliments. And we always got to the right answers, but what he said was true. We're hard-headed and principled, and all of that is very important when you're building a Bitcoin custody business. So it was an honor to work with both Dhruv, Joe, and the rest of the team, now working on Bitcoin payments. So why are we here? About a year and a half ago, we organized an event like this in Dallas, and it was called Bitcoin is Not a Hedge. And leading up to that, the most common question that I would get was, Bitcoin's going down, and everyone said it's a hedge to inflation, and inflation's running rampant. Why isn't Bitcoin going up? And so that was the most common question I got. But the most common question in Bitcoin, the most confusing and confounding thing about Bitcoin, the thing that makes it harder and hardest to understand, is this thing blockchain and crypto. There's 1,000 of these different things. And how can you know that Bitcoin is the one that's going to win. How do you know that Bitcoin isn't MySpace? Here we are in 2025, and Donald Trump just signed an executive order to make a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Cynthia Lummis, the senator from Wyoming, is working on the Bitcoin Act in the U.S. Senate, which now has a co-sponsor and now has a companion bill in the U.S. House of Representatives. The state of Texas has passed a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill through the Senate. It still needs to be taken up in the House. And Bitcoin is worth about $2 trillion, but still very few people understand Bitcoin. Very few. Like if I was to poll test any group of the population, no more than 1 out of 100 people understand Bitcoin. That is a maximum conservative estimate. I would say a more realistic is 0.1% of the population. And that really the dilemma is one of money and not tech. And I generally put people into 3 camps. There's Bitcoiners who generally understand everything we're going to go through. There are crypto and blockchain enthusiasts. And then there's Gen Pop. Gen Pop is the 99%, and they think it's all a sham, and reasonably so. But we're going to help demystify all of it tonight. And where I like to begin is my own story and my own journey and the problem that Bitcoin solves. About 9 years ago, which is crazy to think that it was 9 years ago, I was trying to understand what would happen when the Fed begins to unwind all of the liquidity it put into the system post the great financial crisis. I was working for a hedge fund in Dallas at the time, and through that process, I came to the conclusion that they were always going to have to print money. It wasn't a possibility, it wasn't a probability, it was a certainty. And that is a problem for all of us and for everyone in the world, the problem of printing money. Serendipitously, at the same time, I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and I put 2 and 2 together, that Bitcoin is ultimately the solution to the printing of money. And that's what we're really talking about here. So tonight's about more than Bitcoin. It's about helping you understand why crypto and blockchain is all noise and Bitcoin and its blockchain are all you really need to focus on. In search of a fixed monetary policy. The most important statement I will make, if you were to remember one thing, it's that if Bitcoin credibly enforces its fixed supply, it will emerge as the global reserve currency. And the opposite is also true. If it can't credibly enforce its fixed supply, then it won't. That's very binary. There's a lot baked into that. And if you were to look at a sea of Bitcoin and blockchain and crypto, and there's 2,000 plus cryptos, okay? There's now meme coins that even Donald Trump threw out there. Like anybody can make a coin. The CEO of Coinbase said, I can make you 10 million, meme coins. Like, how can we deal with the regulation? It is impossible to evaluate 1,000 different possibilities. Cryptocurrency 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's just too much information, too much noise. And you still have to get to a place where you can answer the question, how do I know Bitcoin is not MySpace? These are the 2 most important concepts. So if that was the most important statement and the thing that you should take away, that if Bitcoin credibly enforces its fixed supply, that it will emerge as the global reserve currency, these are the 2 concepts that make all of the noise fade to the background. There's a best form of money, and it's simply the one that can't be printed. That if I could pay you in a currency that increased in supply by 3%, that'd be worse than 2%. 2% would be worse than 1%, and 1% would be worse than just a money that can't be printed. That concept is generally more intuitive to people. The one that's less intuitive to people is that money converges to 1, but it doesn't do so by random chance. It does so by necessity. So we're going to get into that concept. And before we get to the why money converges to 1, it's important to accept 2 economic facts, the macro and the micro. Gold. People don't have to understand gold to understand Bitcoin, but they have to accept that the entire world converged on gold as a monetary standard over thousands of years. They've heard of the gold standard. The key question to ask yourself is why, and was it by coincidence? Then on the individual level, 99.9% of all individuals and businesses in the world only interact with one currency on a daily basis. There are a few multinational corporations that operate in multiple currencies every day, but 99.9% of individuals and businesses only interact with one. And the question is, why? And was it by coincidence? It is not by coincidence. It is that trade is an intersubjective problem, and convergence happens by necessity, not coincidence. So why does money converge to one? It is that I must have the form of money that you're willing to accept, and you must have the money that I have. That we must reach a consensus on what money is, and that intersubjective problem between me and you extends out to the next person. If you're going to accept my money, part of your evaluation of what money is and what's the best money is dependent on the next guy. So it's not a one-to-one problem. It's not even a one-to-one-to-one problem. It's actually a 1 to 8 billion problem, that this same identical problem extends out to each next person. Consensus of money is necessary to solving the actual problem, and that is why money converges to one. So in a more practical problem, what is the problem? Well, everyone suffers the same problem. It is money printing. What I have here, and I call this my fool me once, shame on you, fool me 4 times, shame on me, is the money supply of the US dollar. And it is the quantitative easing after the financial crisis, QE1, QE2, QE3, and then the quote COVID money printing crisis, which was 5 trillion. 3.6 trillion were created on a $900 billion base from 2009 to 2014, and then from 2020 to 2022, 5 trillion. They are going to have to print money forever. And the reason is because of the imbalance between debt and the amount of money that can service that debt. So in comes Bitcoin. And coming back to this most important statement, if Bitcoin credibly enforces its fixed supply, then it will emerge as the global reserve currency. It's important to understand, and we'll get through the why here in these different parts of the presentation, that Bitcoin's fixed supply is the 0 to 1 innovation. If you've ever read or heard of Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, we're talking about things like electricity, the telegraph, the steam engine. Bitcoin's 0 to 1 innovation is its fixed supply. How Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply is non-trivial. So many people make the mistake of looking at Bitcoin and jumping to crypto and blockchain, and they hear this statement that there are only 21 million Bitcoin, and they don't endeavor to try to understand, well, how does that happen? But that's the magic. That's what matters. And Bitcoin's fixed supply is credible, importantly, because no one has to trust anybody else. It can only do that because it's inherently decentralized, and the word decentralized has also been trivialized by the crypto and blockchain folks. Dhruv is going to talk about what decentralized means in the context of how Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply, and importantly, at the system level, why the fixed supply was the appropriate and essential simplifying technical solution to making the whole concept of digital money work.
So Parker asked a really important question. How does Bitcoin credibly enforce its fixed supply? So I have a really simple answer to this question. It's because Bitcoin is decentralized, right? End of talk. If you understand decentralized exactly the same way that I do, well, then that answer makes sense to you. If you don't, then it probably feels unsatisfying. Yeah, I agree. What does decentralization really mean, and why, if Bitcoin is decentralized, does that imply it's able to defend its fixed supply? Well, let's start with decentralized. Decentralized means Bitcoin lacks barriers to entry. It lacks trusted third parties or single points of failure, right? When we are operating Bitcoin, interacting with it, we are all peers. There's no special set of users or controllers or rule makers that acts above us as participants in the network. Nobody in the network has advanced foreknowledge of how the network is operating. Nobody has special ability to control the network or change it over time. And looking at some of these numbers, we've got thousands of core developers and companies. We've got tens of thousands of nodes, millions of people mining for Bitcoin and owning it. This is a large group of people. This is a really large and arguably the most valuable decentralized system human beings have ever made. No other cryptocurrency, we're going to see some numbers towards the end of this talk, can really compare with these numbers. Okay, but so what? How does being decentralized actually enforce the fixed supply? Well, the answer is simple, right? If you want to change the fixed supply, you have to convince a whole lot of people around the world who don't know each other and who aren't necessarily in communication and aren't necessarily coordinating in any other way other than engaging with Bitcoin directly. How will you achieve this? Right? And I want to be clear, this is you could probably convince some of the people to go with your new idea. Hey, let's increase the Bitcoin supply because there's not enough of them and I would like some more. You could probably convince some people to do it, but then what will happen next? They'll have to write software. You'll have to convince people to run that software. You have to convince even more people to run that software. Companies will have to get on board. Millions of people will have to decide to mine your version of Bitcoin rather than the main version of Bitcoin that everyone knows and understands. Hundreds of millions of people will have to voluntarily choose your strange new mutated version of Bitcoin over the one that they've become accustomed to, whose rules they understand and whose value they already can appreciate. It's a very tall order. It's very difficult to do given how large these numbers have become. Now, I want to make it clear, it's not that Bitcoin doesn't change. Bitcoin has changed, it continues to change, and it must continue to do so because it has to keep up with the times, it has to stay ahead of security threats, and it has goals that it hasn't yet achieved. So Bitcoin does change, and that chart that I'm showing is a graph of GitHub commits, essentially a graph of how frequently Bitcoin source code is changing. So it's changing all the time in response to small local changes as well as large consensus changes. But what it can't do is it can't be changed because some special interest wants to change it, and especially in a way which is adversarial or not in the interest of Bitcoin or its users. To conclude, you can't increase the fixed supply because there is no money printer for you to capture. So it sounds like what I'm saying is decentralization defends Bitcoin's fixed supply. And I am saying that, but I'm not saying only that. I'm making a slightly stronger and I think more interesting claim. So you may imagine, for example, that you could have had any supply curve you wanted. You could have had a complex dynamic way in which you change the supply of Bitcoin over time to respond to real world events and concerns much closer to the way that we think about traditional fiat currencies and their supply. And perhaps that could have been defended with decentralization. But I don't think that's actually possible because I don't think that's how it works. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of cryptocurrencies and why the finite supply was so important in Bitcoin's success. Indeed, Bitcoin is not some new thing that showed up out of the blue, like falling to Earth from outer space in 2008 out of nowhere. No, Bitcoin is the endpoint of like 40 years of like significant research in cryptography, distributed systems, a lot of the ideas that you perhaps associate with Bitcoin, notions like the blockchain or proof of work. These ideas were around and in other projects for decades before Bitcoin came out. So what did Satoshi do that was so interesting? Is it the difficulty adjustment, if you've heard of that phrase? Well, I don't think so. I think the most interesting and novel idea Satoshi had was to engage in monetary policy, to declare a fixed supply for Bitcoin up front and then choose to implement the currency after that point. And I'll show you why I think that makes such a big difference. Let's ask a really simple question that's really hard to answer. Say I want to build a digital currency. I'm one of the projects that came before Bitcoin. How will I get this currency into the hands of the people I intend to use it? It sounds like a trivial statement, but before you can solve other problems like how do we transact in this currency or how can we grow it and so on, you just have to ask the very simple question, how are people going to get their hands on it, right? So they can use it, get it in circulation. Here are some approaches you might try that won't work, right? You can't distribute your currency based on the balances of existing accounts like checking accounts or brokerage accounts or based on real estate ownership because you can't access that kind of information from within a decentralized system. If your decentralized system is talking to Charles Schwab's website to determine people's balances, it's no longer going to be very decentralized. That point of contact with the existing fiat infrastructure is the point of control and capture that can be used. And so decentralized systems can't really talk to existing asset infrastructure in any way at all. They're completely divorced. They can't understand it. Okay, here's something else you can't do. You can't just create your currency and give it to a bunch of people that you know, like your friends and family or your co-developers or your colleagues or people that you like versus the people that you don't like. If you've done so, you've immediately centralized the currency, right? You've consolidated the entire supply in the hands of a small number of people, and then they have to spread it out to everybody else. So that's already not decentralized. You might try to give a little bit of your currency to every single person in the world. That sounds pretty decentralized, but how will you do that? How will you prevent people from getting allocations more than once? Like in order to force a strong sense of identity, will you rely on social security numbers? Will you rely on fingerprints? That is just once more reintroducing a dependency on a central authority in order to be able to solve the problem. So this is actually trickier than it sounds, right? It turns out that historically, the solution was thought of as proof of work, this idea of unforgeable costliness, which is Nick Szabo's phrase to describe it. Proof of work is important because what it allows us to do in the context of a decentralized digital currency is it allows me, for example, to take my computer, or in this case, what appears to be a large facility of computers, about which we will return to later when we talk about mining. It allows me to take my computer and to do a bunch of work, computations, use electricity to do so, get them all nice and hot. And the output of that is I get a small piece of data. It's called a proof of work. I can share it on the internet. And what's so remarkable about this small piece of data is that I can give it to somebody else. And they don't have to know me. They don't have to understand my computers. They don't have to check in with a central authority. They can look at that tiny piece of data and they can verify you must have done a whole bunch of computations. It's self-verifying. And because computations cost real-world resources, electricity, and other things, there's some value that's being expressed by this proof. So maybe we can use that notion, that unforgeable costliness, that digital value to anchor in some way a kind of digital currency and get the supply out to the people who need to use it. All right, how might we actually do that though? Let's be specific, right? Specificity is often when you lose audiences, right? So let's go slowly and we'll walk through it and we'll try to understand why having a fixed supply was, despite proof of work, was the key insight that Satoshi made that really drove Bitcoin forward and allowed it to succeed where other projects failed. So let's start with the first idea. This is something inspired by something called Hashcash. Of course, I'm simplifying through all these slides. Hashcash is a really simple idea. Hey, I created a proof of work by doing some computations. Why don't we just treat that as money? I'll just give you the proof of work. You give me whatever I want. You know, this basket of goods over here that's illustrated. This is a bad form of money, right? For a variety of reasons. Chief among them, like to the point Parker was making in his part just before, how am I confident that if I accept this proof of work, that I will be able to share it with another third party and that they will accept it from me? That's not clear at all to me. But even ignoring issues like that, let's just ask even a simpler question. How much is this proof of work worth? How many apples should be in that basket based on the proof of work that I received? That's for me a really hard question to answer. In order to know the answer, I need to know how many proof of works are there in the world? How hard is this computation to do? How many people are engaging in this activity worldwide? There's some supply aspect that has to be involved with understanding how to value that proof of work. How am I going to do that? I'm just trying to sell you this basket of goods. Too complicated. Okay. And also worse, right? The computations become easier over time, typically, as computing equipment becomes better. So these proof of works will actually become less valuable over time. That's very frustrating. Money is meant to, in some sense, retain its value or grow or at least be fungible. What if we try a more complex solution? Okay, it's hard for us to value these individual proofs. Why don't we come up with some special role, a dealer, a bundler, someone that assays the supply of proof of work out there at a given moment of time and bundles a bunch of different proofs together in some cool bundle box. And then we just use the bundles like money instead of the direct proofs. This is slightly better, like someone is trying to solve this problem of how do we price money over time. But who is the bundler? Where do they live? How many of them are there? Can I be a bundler? Like, none of these questions are really answered, and BitGold never really gets implemented because this is a challenging way to do it. Let's move to the third example. This is a lot closer to what Bitcoin ultimately decides to do. Hey, instead of trying to literally value computations and trying to understand how good computers are, why don't we just turn this into a direct auction, right? If we want to create units of this money called B money in this historical project, if I want to create some units of B money, I'll just propose a bid. This many computations for this many units of B money. And then Stephen could propose his own bid. And then Parker could propose his own bid. And we would collect a whole bunch of bids that we will use to subsequently, when we do our proof of work, create money from the bids that we created. Are you confused by this? Does this sound confusing? It is confusing. It is very difficult for anybody to actually implement this system. Who are the bidders? Where are the bids going to be stored? Like, in which order should we create money based on the bids that we had at a given moment in time? What happens when two participants in this network see a different set of bids? How are we to resolve all these conflicts with each other? None of these questions are addressed by the proposers of B money, and so this project never gets built. What is Satoshi's solution? It is extremely simple, right? Satoshi had a goal, which was absent in the design of these historical projects. Satoshi's goal was a fixed supply of money for its own reason, for its own sake. That allowed Satoshi to radically simplify the proposals we were seeing on the prior page. Instead of having to determine a dynamic monetary policy over time that requires input from the millions of users that might be using Bitcoin in the future, Satoshi simply created 21 million Bitcoin, pin drop. And then the future was, how do we sell the 21 million Bitcoin that Satoshi created in 2008 on a regular schedule of 50 every 10 minutes, decaying every 4 years by a factor of 2, so that over the next 140 years, these 21 million Bitcoin would enter circulation into the hands of the people who bought them. And yes, that's right. Miners are not creating these Bitcoins. They are purchasing them from the Bitcoin network in exchange for computations. In return, the Bitcoin network is receiving security for the order in which it's dispensed these Bitcoins into circulation. This is a wonderfully simple solution that turns out to be not only implementable, but works. half of the white paper that Satoshi writes is him defending the idea that this will actually lead to Nakamoto consensus. The difficulty adjustment, often heralded as one of the most interesting and innovative features in Bitcoin, I believe is actually an attempt to just preserve this monetary release schedule. From a coordination perspective, users in this network do not need to communicate with each other about optimal money creation parameters, as they might have to do in the more complicated B-money model. They simply try to hew back to Satoshi's original plan for how to release the money, the fixed supply into circulation. If Bitcoin are being produced too quickly, we will increase the price of money. It is denominated in computations. If Bitcoin are not being produced quickly enough, we will decrease the price of money as denominated in computations. And that's what the difficulty adjustment accomplishes. So I want to repeat myself very clearly. Yes, it is true. Decentralization defends the fixed supply that Parker values, I think rightly, that makes Bitcoin special, that ensures it can become a global reserve. But the fixed supply, just as well, enables decentralization in the first place. It simplifies the auction that is used to price money as it is released into circulation. And that was Satoshi's most original and interesting contribution to this field. Now, you'll notice I did not say the word blockchain once during this entire exercise. And that's because I don't believe the blockchain is as important or as innovative as is often talked about in other cryptocurrencies. But to hear that part of the story, I will hand it back to Parker.